Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another edition of the Middle Georgia Spotlight. I'm your host, Jack Ellis. Good to be with you. My very first program of the year, of course, Middle Georgia Spotlight has been on, and I want to thank Ron Wildman for hosting a couple of shows in my absence earlier this year. And of course, we are taping here in late January, but this show will air in early February, which happens to be Black History Month. So that will be our topic of discussion today. But before we get to that, let me thank our sponsors, Caduceus Medicine and J. Franklin Automotive. And let me also add that the views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of WMUB, Mercer University, and or our sponsors, but those of the hosts and my guests. So joining us this week in the Spotlight, he's been here before for a very brief period of time, but I wanted to have him back, especially during Black History Month, is E.O. Peace. E.O. Peace is a spiritual leader, an educator, and a teacher, and has lived in different parts of the world and understands different cultures, and we'd like to welcome him to our program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You know, let's talk a little bit about you before we get into some of the things that you do. Of course, you were born and raised in Macon.
Yes, sir.
Attended and grew up in Jim Crow Macon, as did I. In segregated Jim Crow Macon.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now, how did that impact you as a young man? I know how it impacted me. How did that impact you, if negatively or positively, growing up in a totally segregated society?
Well, my father always encouraged us to read. And I saw my mother reading all the time. So I read a lot of books on Black history from my father's collection. Of course, when I was at Ballard Hudson High School, Mr. Martin had a great collection of books on Black history in the library. And I think that was on the reading real studying that I did at Ballard Hudson. I was studying Black history. So I didn't have that inferiority complex so deeply grained into me. I felt that through my reading and research that Black people came from a great history. They had a great history, great culture, great civilization, and that we all could strive for higher than we were being exposed to. So although that so-called Jim Crow was here, I don't think it made me feel inferior. I couldn't accept that. I wouldn't accept that. In fact, by the time I got to the 11th grade, I was involved in the movement, Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement. And a number of us were locked up down at the courthouse, 17 of us at that particular time. Some people hearing this might remember that. It was in 1960, I think, 1960.
Yeah.
And so I could not relate to.
But it was before your face every day. I mean, you and I, you were maybe a year. Well, we're about the same age, and I grew up in Macon too, and I can recall. And on the screen of my mind, even today, I remember riding the bus out to Unionville. I would take the bus on the corner of Broadway and Cherry and Bellevue, Elizabeth Bellevue, and I remember looking at the sign that it was in big print in the front of the bus. White passengers seated from front, colored passengers seated from rear. And then in addition, it had a white line on the floor that said you don't go above. This was a dividing line. And that had an impact on me. And that I would sit there and look at that as a young boy, as a 14 and 15-year-old, and I used to get pretty angry about it.
Well,
so you never got angry.
I've been angry, of course.
But you never displayed anger.
Well, the thing is, some of the best days of my life was spent in Irvington, Georgia, with my grandparents. And because my grandfather was a Mason. In fact, he was, of course, you're a Mason, you know how those things work, but he was the head of the Masons there in Irvington, and my father was a Mason also. And so in Irvington, so many Masons would come around to my grandfather's home and had a store too. So most of the Masons that I knew about never felt displayed any kind of inferiority complex. I know I never saw my grandfather scratching where he didn't itch or laughing when it wasn't funny. And and then my father was the same way. He loved everyone. I think my father just, he had so much love.
In other words, there was no shuffling and grinning going on.
Oh, no.
With
So,
the role models that you had.
with the role models that I had, yes. And so I think it's just that environment, the immediate environment that I came up in, my grandparents and in my father and mother's home. Yes.
So, but now you are a teacher now, so you've taken
Well,
that.
I was. I'm retired.
Well, I said you're still a teacher.
Oh,
I
yes,
don't mean
that's
that by
exactly.
you're a teacher because you teach young people.
Yes,
and you teach me, and I consider you a teacher.
Yes.
But so what you're basically saying is that study and know thyself. You knew who you were.
Well, I was learning.
Study and you were learning, but but you're saying now if we know who we are as a people and where we come from, we wouldn't have some of the things going on that we.
Yes, sir. That's the problem. Most of us do not know our history, so we don't know the dignity and the self-respect that our ancestors had.
So, but you get to know that by reading, but you have to pursue it, or someone has to bring you to that.
Yes, so that was my grandparents' home and my parents' home. The books that I read on Black history, of course, were out of my father's library. And then the library at Dallas Hudson High School. R.J. Martin, Mr. Martin had a great selection of Black history books in the library there. And that's not the only reading that I did at Dallas Hudson was reading on Black history. So by the time I was in the 10th grade, I was involved in the movement.
Yeah. Well, your younger brother and I were contemporaries. David.
Right.
And matter of fact, I bumped into David on Okinawa once. I was in the 173rd station on Okinawa at the time, and he was in the Air Force. And he was an Air Force policeman. And I had broken bed check.
He worked very hard for your election here.
Yes, he did. And I miss him dearly. I'm sure you do as well. But the point I make is that the family structure, the family unit, your family and other families that exhibited positive, if you will, environments as we grew. So you're saying that what's missing now in terms of our community and the mayhem that we see, especially young African American men that's going astray?
Well, I can speak for my environment. I was encouraged to read and to read our history, to know our history. So I read Richard Wright's books and it came in Chains and so many other authors that I can recall that I was exposed to from my immediate home. The only time that I was really very angry, I think, when I came back from Vietnam and the way most of us Vietnam veterans are treated. See, and plus I was written up in the paper here during that time for some things that I did there to save my platoon or my company. And a lot of people found a fault with that when I came back. So I only stayed here about maybe 2 years when I came back from Vietnam, and then I went out to California. Yeah.
Well, that's why I want to get to that, because you travel extensive, not just in this country, but around the world. Yeah. And so even though it was early childhood was shaped by your father,
and my
books,
grandfather,
your grandfather at the high school, but then you went to a broader world, and India, and then to Africa, East Africa, and lived. So how has that impacted? What difference? How has that made you more conscious, if you will, if I can use that word, your level of consciousness as really based on?
Well, when one goes into Africa, and I lived in Africa from 1973 to 1978, and to see black people running their banks and piloting their planes and just in charge.
Something you didn't see as a boy growing up.
Right, and then to be there when Mzee Jomo Kenyatta was there. That was in the early 70s. Yeah. When Jomo Kenyatta was there, and Nyeri over in Tanzania, Kaunda down in Zambia.
Otu was over in Uganda.
Well, when I was there, when I was at Egypt, he was over there then, so to see black people doing things, and then in India, to see black people and brown people, darker complexion people, because I can remember here in Macon, when we used to have people right on the sidewalk, go back to Africa, they didn't say feces color, but they called us the name of feces, right?
Right.
And they'd write it on the pavement here. But you have to, Jomo Kenyatta did a book, and my father taught me too, to suffer without bitterness. That one cannot operate in bitterness, and that the foundation of our consciousness is love. In fact, we are awareness. So I came up in a situation where we were taught to go within. And when we go deep within, we'll find out that the very foundation of our awareness is no designation. It's truth, righteousness, love, and peace. And the more we engage in a spiritual practice that cleanses our consciousness, that love, that peace, it shines forth. And the more that shines forth, the more we have love and truth, righteousness towards all living beings, not just human beings. Because the first spiritual teaching is that we're not the body, that we're eternal spirit or soul. And the goal of life is union, like and we talked about yoga last time. The goal of yoga is union with God, God realization. But one has to be cleansed up. We cannot have dirty consciousness and think we're going to realize God. We're not going to be able to realize God if we're living in the flesh. So we first come to the spiritual platform, saying that I'm eternal soul. I'm not the body. I am spirit. And God is spirit. And we worship God in spirit and in truth. And the more we engage in a spiritual practice that helps us remember God, then our consciousness is cleansed, it's purified. The consciousness is purified. Why? Because God is the most pure. And the more we associate with God through our spiritual practice, our consciousness is purified of anger, lust, greed, illusion, madness, and envy.
So you're talking to God all high, on the most high.
I'm talking about
only God. You can call him whatever you want. We're not talking about any deity like
No, we're talking about
God.
The one that is omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. And we have a number of words in different African language for this. But in our language out of Ghana that stretches around to Central Africa, we say Jinyami. Jinyami. And that means omnipotent, omnipresent, and what's the other way? Omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. And that's one. It's one that pervades and transcends everything. It's like some people came to Africa, they said, oh, those Africans over there worshiping that tree. We don't worship the tree, but we know that God pervades and transcends the tree. The God that we worship pervades and transcends everything. Every subatomic particle, every vibratory phenomenon. It's eternal, full of unlimited bliss and knowledge. This is the one God that we had before Islam came into Africa, before Christianity came into Africa, before any of these religions came into Africa. We had the concept. But to go back to this so-called black person in America, when we do our research, we'll find out there were black people in America before the Indians came across the Bering Straits into so-called North America. There were black people already here.
Before the Mayflower.
Before the Mayflower, before any kind of slavery. There were black people here. So there were black people here in this country. Some came out of Africa in slave ships, and some are already here. There's really, if you go all over the world, you see black people all over the world.
I know, I was reading this morning about China.
China too.
Trying to get out of China. They realized so many Africans in China.
Right.
Trying to get out because of the disease.
Right.
Let me go back to something that you said. I served in Vietnam by the same time you did. We overlapped. I was out there in November of 67, came back, and the end of November 1968. So I was in Vietnam when Dr. King was murdered, April 68. I was in the infantry, as were you. We were out in the bush, we call it, in the jungle. And I was conflicted somewhat when Dr. King was murdered, when we finally got word. I just, and having, all of my thoughts went back to what had happened back here in Macon as a boy, when I was trying to get a hamburger at the Krispy and couldn't get one, when I was sitting on the back of the bus. And here I am fighting for our country, and I just felt so betrayed that they had taken the life of my Messiah, if you will, and maybe we shouldn't worship any man, but he was the closest thing to, other than my father and other Messiah. So how did you deal with that? How were you conflicted in Vietnam as a young black man from Macon, Georgia, where you had experienced racism at its height, but here you are fighting for your country and for yourself, and your buddies around you to say, like, how were you conflicted?
I think reading has always helped me. When I was in Fort Valley, Fort Valley State College, and I was in my senior year when I was drafted out of Fort Valley. But I remember seeing a sign in the educational building at Fort Valley State College, university now, that said, "Send me a man who reads, and reading maketh a full man." Now, I brought that from the Fort Valley State College, and it helped me so much. And so when I was in Vietnam, those of us who had been to college, we kind of hung out together. And a lot of them were getting books from home. And my brother, Peyton, sent jazz to me. So we had lots of jazz back in the company area. But in the field, I carried books. And we all talked about the books that we were reading. I read Lawrence of Arabia. I read Sammy Davis, They Came in Chains. I read most of Vance Packett's books. Vance Packett did books on economics. And Dr. Ponder from the Fort Valley State College introduced me to Vance Packett. Dr. Ponder went on to become president of Fisk University for many years. But he introduced me to Vance Packett's books. And so I read those in Vietnam, and the other fellows that had been to college, many of us, some of these fellows had gone to some of the Ivy League schools, but we've all ended up in Vietnam, right? And so we hung together, and we read, and we talked about books. And when we were back in the company area, we listened to John Coltrane and Miles Davis and Charlie Parker, and all the rest. It was really nice music. So we didn't talk. I tell you, just about when I remember when things got a little really tight. We were in the field. We were out in the bush when the riots were going on in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And we saw APCs on the streets in New Jersey. Now that caused a little bit of friction.
Yeah. Even in Detroit. Detroit was burning in
all
September
over,
'67. You were in Vietnam because I was at Fort Campbell,
right.
And we sent one of our brigades, battalion, to Detroit to put down the riot while we were training to go to Vietnam.
That was a little disconcerting there when we saw the tanks and APCs on the street.
Armored personnel carriers.
Yeah, armored personnel carriers. That's right, APC. Right. So otherwise, we read. Okay. And we did our duty. We did our duty.
That's how you got.
Yeah, right. And we were about doing our duty. Yeah. And most of us didn't think about that.
Now here you are, a very mature man and a very learned man, travel around the world, and now you're back home and you're trying to share what with the younger generation, trying to expose them to, and not expose, but to educate them about what?
Well, I was impressed in Vietnam with the Buddhist monks. Most people in Vietnam, as you know, soldiers, USO workers, or clergy people, they all had the faces up between the eyebrows were all wrinkled up, like a prune between the eyes. Everyone was stressed, except the Buddhist monks. I noticed them. Their faces were smooth, like a baby's face. And they never walked on the sidewalk. They walked on the street. And one time we were in the deep jungle, and you know how it is in Vietnam. In the jungle, you can hardly see 3 or 4 feet in front of you. And we ran into a little temple out in the jungle.
Pagoda.
Well, these monks were living there, about 3 or 4 months.
They call them pagodas or monks?
I don't know what they call it. But anyway, out in the deep jungle, and you know how it is in the jungle. Now, you have not just Viet Cong, but you have snakes and lions, all kinds, lots of leeches, right, and red ants. But they were living there serene. So I was impressed with that in Vietnam. And so I'm thankful, I'm really grateful that I was able to get through that experience. And I can't even remember. I think there was one fellow that I can remember from Vietnam. But our turnover was so fast. Yeah. The companies were turning over so fast, so you didn't get a chance to learn the names of the people there. So I'm thankful, and I've been guided, I think, guided. And when I came back to Macon for that 2 years, when I left, I knew I had to leave. And I'm glad I did, because I was going crazy in Macon, because I was, because there were so many black people, black fellows that didn't go to Vietnam, who were really very antagonistic toward me, because I was written up in the newspaper for saving my company. I mean, it just happened. That's the way it happened. You know how it is in Vietnam. You're not talking black or white. You're about doing what you have to do.
Exactly.
And so I'm glad I left. I tried to go to Fort Valley for 2 years. For those 2 years, I couldn't relate to it. And so I went to California. And then I went to a number of other places. And so I've come back here, and I brought what I have back to Macon. And I received, I know I don't want to sound too strange, but I feel that I was supposed to bring what I had back to Macon. So I brought it back to Macon, and here we are talking about it now.
Yeah. Now, you're a very interesting man in a lot of ways. And I guess you changed your name at some point because everyone would know the Coswells, and you were Coswell.
Yes.
And, I knew your whole family, and your mom was a dear soul, and your father worked at the Elks
He was a maitre d'. He was a maitre d' there for 41 years.
At the Elks Club. So
on Mulberry Street.
Mulberry Street. So my point is, you lived in a middle class environment, if you will.
Well, yeah, we were raised in the house. The Elks Club was a house. So we ate very, very well coming up. Really.
But my point is, the family structure, and now you're teaching and trying to educate as many young, not just black people, but white people as to
anyone who can accept it.
Anyone can accept what it takes to be a better person,
that's right,
build a better community, and ultimately a better world.
That's right.
And the keys to that, of course, you've said spirituality, maybe meditating, fasting, reading, and what. So you tell me, what are the keys to your level of peacefulness, if you will, playing on the word of EOP, the peace that permeates from you and all over you whenever I'm with you.
Martin Luther King Jr. had his first encounter with the busters, as far as I know, from here in Macon. He had just come from Dublin, where he was in an oratorical contest. In fact, I've been to that church over there at least twice this year. It's where the dream began, and Martin was about 13 years old. And so he came back here to Macon, and of course they had the seat white from the front to the back, black from the back to the front. So King had to stand up. He was asked to stand up because there weren't enough seats for the white people. So he was refusing to stand up, and his teacher had to beg him to get up out of that seat. So he had to stand all the way back to Atlanta. And at that time, it took us about 2 hours to get to Atlanta. We didn't have freeways then, right? So when I read King's writings, King said he was angry as hell until he was at Crozer Theological Seminary. And at that time, his father had a friend who, from down in Georgia, was at Morehouse with him. His name was Sandy Ray. But meanwhile, Sandy Ray and Martin Luther King Sr. were poor, ragged boys down at Morehouse. In fact, you can read more about that later. But anyway, Martin heard about Gandhi from Mordecai Johnson. Mordecai Johnson had just returned from India. And he was speaking, of course, most of us knew then that Mordecai Johnson was our intellectual giant here in this country. We had W.B. Du Bois and W.B. Du Bois, of course, and Booker T. Washington. But Martin heard Mordecai Johnson, and Mordecai Johnson was talking about Gandhi. And so King said he heard about Gandhi, but after that he went out and bought all the books that he could find on Gandhi. So I knew about King's encounter with the busters here in Macon, and I saw a photograph of King reading a book. And I got my magnifying glass and put it on the book, and he was reading a book by Gandhi. So from King, I went into Gandhi. When I studied Gandhi, I found that Gandhi said that he was reading, in fact, in his autobiography is called The Story of My Experiments with Truth. And that book affected my mind somewhat in the way that the autobiography of Malcolm X affected me. Kind of really. Yeah. But anyway, from Gandhi, I went to his autobiography. And Gandhi was said, and this is almost a verbatim quote, and we should have a book in our library here at Mercer, an autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi, The Story of My Experiments with Truth. But anyway, I make it rapid for you.
No, go ahead.
But anyway, in that book, Gandhi said, and this is just about a verbatim quote from his autobiography, he says, when disappointment stares me in the face, and all around I see not one ray of light, I immediately turn to the Bhagavad Gita, and I see a verse here and a verse there, and I begin to smile in the midst of the greatest tragedies. and my life has been one great tragedy. But if it has left no visible nor or indelible mark upon me, is all due to the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. So when I started, I said, I got to get this book, got to get this Bhagavad Gita. So then I went in to get teachers that could teach me Bhagavad Gita.
So now you're sharing.
The Bhagavad Gita is about the oldest book that I know about on yoga and self-realization that we have, spoken by Sri Krishna some 5,000 years ago on a battlefield. It was spoken to a soldier. Arjuna was a general in his brother's army.
Yeah. Now, that's the spiritual part.
Yes.
And knowing who you are, but the body, the temple that we have, what we have in our town, we have people not eating properly.
That's right.
Obesity is probably run amok in this town. So you say what to people? I know you are vegan.
Yes, sir, I practice.
You practice vegan. So it's not so much of, so how do we get to what goes in your body? How do we get
Well,
to
I think our people can start from a book by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. It's called How to Eat to Live. We can't start there because we don't want any bitterness, and we're not the body. So the very beginning of real spiritual practice is, as you said earlier, coming to the spiritual platform. So as a spiritual being, I don't have any designations. I'm neither black, nor white, nor blue, nor brown, nor Vietnamese, or all these other designations. I'm spiritual being, pure awareness. This is the nature of the self. I'm looking out through the body, and when we start meditating, we meditate from here, at the third eye or the pineal gland, which we understand to be the seat of consciousness. There's some people that think the seat of consciousness is at the heart. Others would name out some of the other chakras we say in yoga. But if you look closer, you'll see that the seat of consciousness is here. But we can't get to spirituality relating to the body as a self. The material body is just in ancient Kemet, we call it the car. It's a car. It's not what the self is. We're looking out through the body. We're not the body with the soul, we're the soul with the body.
So we have about 2 minutes left, but because we are beginning of Black History Month, you're my very first guest. I wanted you to be my first guest. A lot of talk is going on now and about reparation. So you're saying, not what you're saying, but a lot of people are talking about reparation. Matter of fact, I have a book here that I share with you. It's written by a white man, a professor at University of Cornell University, recently out, called "The Half Has Never Been Told," and I put it here. The half has never been told, and it makes the case as to how the African people and African Americans built the wealth that people enjoy now. In other words, built the capitalist system. So let's take it one step further.
Okay.
So if you take this one step further, people are talking about reparation. Where do you come down on that?
Well, first of all, I'm a spiritual being, and I do believe in karma and reincarnation. According to karma, whatever a person's mind is most fixed on at the time of death, and this is why we try to remember God during this lifetime, and we'll talk about that in detail, how you do this. But as a spiritual being, I could have been any kind of being last lifetime. I came this incarnation, I came as in this body here, which is considered to be a so-called African American in this part of the world. But that's not me. I don't identify with this body as being the self. And I'm not alone. There are others out here.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time, but we could go on, and you have so much to share, and I appreciate that what you're doing in this community, because you don't just share on TV, you share in small groups, and you're trying to, anyone who's willing to listen and want to have a higher level of consciousness and a better understanding of self, that you are there to teach it. But I will say, I will share one thing with you. You talked about the monks, the Buddhist monks in Vietnam. I went to Vietnam in this century and spent 2 weeks in Hue in a Buddhist monk colony. And the most peaceful time, pardon pun, but the most peaceful time that I have spent was just being around them because it was so quiet. I mean, they would walk around, you wouldn't hear a word, but you could pray, the chanting sometimes. But So I understand what you're saying. But let me thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for what you do in our community. And we both were in Vietnam. We're glad we survived, and we're definitely glad you survived. You have so much to offer this community, and I appreciate you sharing it.
Maybe next time we can talk about meditation.
Because it's part of it. Meditation, yoga, very much.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Excuse me.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We've been speaking with E.O. Peace, who is a spiritual leader and a teacher. When I say a teacher, he's a retired educator, but he's a teacher without walls, if you will. Now, he doesn't have to be in the classroom. He teaches all over this community. And we'd like to thank you all so much for joining us, and hope you have been inspired or learned something, tidbits about Black history as we journey throughout the month of February and explore different aspects of Black history. Until next week, I'm your host, Jack Ellis. Goodbye.